Canada's public arts funding is often cited as a widely respected model for cultural investment. But are we brave enough to ask if this model is still working? Welcome to the pilot episode of the Mass Culture Podcast presented in partnership with the arts firm. I'm your host, Robin Sokoloski. On today's show, a conversation with Michelle Chawla, Director and CEO of the Canada Council for the Arts.
I think the system of investing in the arts has to just keep evolving. So I'm not at a stage where it's like, oh, let's get rid of that, and that's not. Everything has to keep moving with the forward vision of what are we trying to do.
Public funding has, for the most part, played a big role in the budgets of Canada's arts organizations. According to Mass Culture's DNA platform, in 2023, it made up more than 30% of total revenues. That's a 10% point increase from 2018 and the decade before it. At first glance, that might sound like progress. More public money, more stability, more investment in the arts, but that's not the full story. Other revenue streams like earned income haven't fully recovered since 2020. The rise in the percentage of public funding isn't due to an overall increase in available funds, but rather because other revenue sources have diminished. Meanwhile, arts organizations are up against rising costs that this support alone can't keep pace with. Because so much of Canada's arts activity depends on public funding, that reliance shapes what gets created, who gets supported, and ultimately how cultural life feels across the country. Public funding doesn't just keep the lights on, it has a strong influence on whether artists are working from a place of precarity or stability, whether organizations can take risks or they have to play it safe, and whether entire communities see themselves reflected in our cultural institutions. Canada has a long tradition of public investment in the arts. National, provincial, and municipal funders, whether direct or arm's length, have been central to cultural life for decades. It shapes how the sector comes to understand stability, legitimacy, and risk. It's a model many countries would envy, but like any system, it's a work in progress. The sector is often split between those with stable operating funding, where support is predictable and renewable, and those left to compete year after year for short-term project funding. For some, this two-tiered system creates security. For others, it entrenches precarity. It raises difficult questions. Does operating funding strengthen resilience, or does it risk creating dependency? Does project funding ignite innovation, or does it leave too many artists exhausted from constant application cycles? And then there's the question of what's next. As expectations around equity, access, and transparency grow, and as artists and cultural workers push for more trust-based, process-oriented support, is it time to imagine a third space for funding? One that nurtures systemic resilience rather than institutional survival? To help us explore these questions, I'm joined today by Michelle Chawla, Director and CEO of the Canada Council for the Arts. She's here to talk about her career journey in the public funding sphere. Thank you so much for joining us here in Toronto on this unseasonably wonderful fall day. It's so great to have you here in Toronto.
I'm so happy to be here.
Can you start by sharing a little bit about your career? Specifically, something I don't know is how you came to find yourself working for a public arts funder.
It's a great question. So I have essentially dedicated my entire career to working to support the arts. It's something that I found real profound inspiration in. And interestingly enough, I started as a summer student at the Canada Council for the Arts, never thinking for a moment that this is where I would spend my career from a very young age. So my background is, my father is originally from India and came to Montreal in the late 60s and met my mom, who's French Canadian. And so I come from a mixed background, so Punjabi and Quebecois. And both those cultures, and being in Canada, the arts and culture was part of my upbringing. But in the Sikh community, so I'm a member of the Sikh community, which is the Sikh religion, community service is at the heart of the principles and values of that, of how the Sikh community lives. So for me, the idea of combining the arts and culture, which I absolutely love, with some deep personal values around community service landed me where I am today.
And so how have these experiences shaped your perspective on public funding? Because how many years has it been?
So yeah, it's been, I'm going to age myself. 30 years.
Since you started at the Canada Council.
Yes, yes. And 30 years that flew by, like I would say it's 3 minutes, because I've done every single type of position, role. I never cared about what the job title was. I've been the Secretary General for the Canadian Commission for UNESCO, so I'm not sure how many people know that the Canadian Commission for UNESCO falls under the responsibility of the Canada Council. But the through line for me has always been tied to this idea of public service and the arts, which I deeply, deeply care about, because I think this country, us as human beings, find hope and our voices through the arts. So the privilege, I call it the absolute honor and privilege of being able to combine deep personal values with something that is meaningful, I think is what has inspired me from day one, which is why I honestly cannot believe it's been 30 years. It feels like 3 minutes, honestly.
I think we're really aligned there with how we both came into the arts and feel about the arts. I'm extremely passionate when it comes to the art sector in Canada, and really being able to work at a level that supports the sector holistically is just so important to me. And so I see that in you as well. And just the generosity that you have to connect with the folks on the ground in the art sector is just so important. And I see that as a very significant change in how funders are working in relationship with the community. Have you seen any other changes that are coming to mind over those 30 years?
Yeah. Well, I think this idea of, and you use the word relationship, the idea that we are in a continuous and evolving relationship with each other, for me is a really critical aspect of how I'm leading the council, but I think ties to the changes that we've seen. I think the idea of institutions or organizations seeing their work in a narrow mandate that, you know, I'll use the Canada Council being the organization I lead, that we are the Canada Council and we will operate in isolation thinking that we have all the answers, I think is absolutely the opposite of how we should be working. And I think there are a lot of parallels between what you're doing, what we're doing with other funders. I think anyone who's involved in leading the arts and culture in the broadest sense possible, today we have to work together there. And I know it sounds sometimes like it's an easy thing. Oh yeah, let's work together. But what you realize is that the vast differences between, you know, even from a regional perspective, an artistic discipline perspective, a size of budget perspective, a mandate perspective, those differences can be so broad that sometimes it's easier to focus on what I do versus what we can do. And I cannot underestimate how working in this new model of a relationship is, for me, I think the future for all of us. So I really appreciate the opportunity to having these types of conversations.
On that, what do you feel is the public's expectation of funders? How has that changed over time?
Yeah, those are questions I ask myself often. And I think one of the big changes is the expectations around funding. If you think back, especially public funders, we are held accountable to how do we invest public funding. That is it's public funding. So it's the dollars of all Canadians that I feel, have a big responsibility because we've been entrusted with this. And so how we distribute that funding or provide that funding to the arts sector has a level of scrutiny which I think continues to increase. So if I think back of like what's changed, the expectations around public investment in the arts have changed. How we demonstrate the impact of public investment in the arts have changed. Definitions of equity have changed. And with that, I think a higher level of, I call it not integrity, but rigor and transparency. So all the things that you would expect, like we should be able to say to anybody who asks, what did you do with that money? Where did it go? Who benefited and why? Why is this investment so critical? And I think those are things that, again, it's not the Canada Council that has all the answers. I think we, and especially the work that you're doing at Mass Culture, is a great example. We have to work on those answers together. And I find it exciting.
Yeah, me too. I feel like there's a whole wide, vast space to be working in this space to get people, specifically arts workers, artists, really engaged in that process of understanding and learning from the work that they're doing and being really proud and honest about how they're sharing that with the wider public, for sure. I want to talk about the funding model specifically. Much of our sector relies on project funding. In your view, what are the strengths and limitations in that model? Focusing just on the project funding for a moment.
Yeah, definitely. I think project funding is critical. It's absolutely critical. It's one of the tools that we have that can touch a lot of things. So it's, first of all, it's the first entry point for many applicants who come to the Canada Council is through project funding. So there's an equity dimension there, really important equity dimension, because it's your access into funding. It drives innovation. It's very flexible. It's adaptable. It doesn't have all of the long-term outcomes that we would expect from some of the other types of funding. It is also where there's a very high level of what I call risk-taking. And in all of the positive senses of the word, Canada Council is like a venture capitalist. Like you're investing in talent, in innovation, but you're taking a risk because you actually don't know what that outcome will be. And what we've seen consistently is, if you look at the history of the Canada Council's funding for the last 50 years, is often those project grants is what led to the careers of most of Canada's artists who are known today. So there's a really interesting dimension around project funding. Now, limitations, it's always interesting to think of public funding of the arts, and now I'm trying to use language about investing in the arts as opposed to funding the arts.
I was just about to ask you about that word.
I really think we need to talk about investing, because when you talk about investing in the business language, there's a return. You're not just funding things, and of course we'll always fund artists, but it's also, there's something that you get back when you invest in artists, and whether it's this Canadian voices, whether it's connections with communities, whether it's innovation, transformation, we get something out of it. And so for me, there's always going to be limitations, because how do you manage volume? How do you manage the growing demand? How do you manage equity questions? So there's always going to be tensions within allocation of funding. Having said that, in my view, there's really no perfect system. So how do we keep evolving funding models so that they keep transforming and adapting to our future landscape? But for me, a big shift is that those shifts in the funding model have to happen through a collaborative model versus the Canada Council, who, may have the answer to everything, because I'm telling you right now, we do not. The Canada Council does not have the answer to every single problem concerning arts funding. But what we do have is a lot of information, a lot of understanding and context because of the place we occupy, but a real desire to apply all of that knowledge in a model of co-delivery, co-development, co-building, and also being very open to listening to the limitations of the models that are at play. And I would say they're very similar to models across most funding agencies. And I would even say funding agencies outside of the arts and culture. So if you look at science and you look at technology, I think our job is to constantly evolve and transform how we invest in the arts.
When it comes to project funding, one of the, I think, sticking points for sure that I see coming up, and you're right, it's not just within the arts, it's beyond, it's the nonprofit sector, is the labor involved in. So what's some of your thoughts and thinking around, or discussions you're having with other fellow colleagues about that particular piece?
Of the labor of preparing applications?
Year after year, time and time, like just constant, even if they're successful every year, or constantly dealing with potentially the fear of rejection, which is just part of the competition. But just wondering around that piece specifically, just that labor that's
No, it's
involved.
it comes up. It does come up because, for a lot of artists, the amount of time they spend on preparing grant applications can be very onerous. And so we've heard this, like I've been traveling across the country, and I've heard this particularly from artists, but also from arts administrators. So there's a couple of things I would say is anything that we can do to try and simplify, we want to do that. How do we simplify our processes so that peer assessment committees get sufficient information to make an assessment on the applications that come forward, but also in a way that addresses that question of labor. So we recently launched a new online system that is meant to try to simplify the application process. Of course, it's just brand new, so there's going to be, the learning curve, but we're hoping also that with more transparency. So one of the things we're trying to improve is giving feedback on applications, so that, back to your question about labor, people understand what worked, what didn't work, how did they score on certain parts of the application. They will be able to keep improving and not having to start from scratch. And the other thing is the support from the program officers, who are really they play such a critical function in terms of that connection with the community and capacity to help artists and others manage the application process. But the other thing is, should not discount the relationship, or I should say, maybe that's not the right word, but we should continue to deepen the connections between all levels of funding. So what we've observed is that when an artist has experience applying at the municipal level, then they have experience applying at the provincial level. By the time they get to the Canada Council, those who've had those experience in applying for grants, that labor and the burden of feeling overwhelmed by the type of application, you gain experience with those things. So that's, for us, also a really important dimension, is working with other levels of funding to see how can we mutually support each other. And that's what we're trying to do. For instance, in Alberta, we've just launched a new, different way of working. So rather than, trying to do everything in our offices through the headquarters, we hired consultants whose job is to help support the arts community apply to the Canada Council, and also help the Canada Council better understand the arts ecosystem in Alberta. That's just an example, but...
And that's just being piloted now, right?
Just now, yeah. We just launched it this summer.
And so will the insights from that be kind of shared?
Absolutely, yeah. We are very committed. I'm very committed to transparency and things that work, and also things that don't work, and that's okay. Like I think I've known in the past that sometimes anything that might be seen as a critical observation, sometimes people don't receive that too well, and that's just human nature. I think that nothing's personal. Like, really, it's not personal. If there's observations, both that are on ourselves, like when we see, oh, like we tried that, wasn't the best, let's try something else, but also what the community is telling us, what the arts sector is telling us. It's absolutely essential if we genuinely want to move into co-development strategies as opposed to, the more traditional top-down models, which I'm trying to change.
On that note, I wanted to shift over to the other side of the spectrum within that model, which is the core operating funding.
Yeah.
It's often treated as the gold standard.
Yeah.
If you get that funding as an arts organization, you almost feel like you've made it.
Mm-hmm.
Even if it's only like $20,000 a year, you feel like you got your foot in the door and you are fully a part of the sector. But I'm curious if you actually think that strengthens the art sector, building resilience and regeneration and independence, or do you think there are some risks in that, pursuing that model?
So I think, let's start with core funding. Absolutely, what core funding offers is stability. Mm-hmm. There is no question that when for the next 3 years, next 4 years, that there's a certain stability in the funding, means that you can do planning, means that you can hire people, means that you can take longer term commitments. And I think, and core funding is primarily to arts organizations. And as you said, large and small. It could be millions, it could be thousands. There's something around the stability that it offers. I have heard also, this idea that is, what is core funding really? Is it the gold stamp and once you're in forever? I believe that the recipients of core funding go through extremely rigorous assessments, and the expectations are very different than project funding. Project funding does not have the same, I'll use the language, strings attached, but the same level of accountabilities. And what we're seeing in the conversations that we're having with organizations is the stability of funding is absolutely necessary. But at the same time, the expectations on those organizations to be anchors in their communities, to be employers, to be developing original programming, to bring in audiences, to make connections, I think is needed more than ever in terms of the capacity for an organization like the Canada Council to invest in arts organizations from coast to coast to coast. There is also this idea, I think, and it's, I'm not debating whether it's right or wrong, but we do know that there's sometimes this idea, it's like, oh yeah, it's the same old organizations and they keep getting the money over and over again. We're right now in the process of the next cycle of core funding for a large majority of arts organizations. And for the first time since before the pandemic, we're having in-person peer assessment committees, and for all of the core applications. And so I've been going down because my office is on the 4th floor. The juries are all happening on the 2nd floor. I've been going to say hello to all the juries because just to express my appreciation for the absolute care and devotion. That's the only way I could put it. The amount of time our peer committees are spending reading the material, and you could see how much responsibility they take for those conversations. And what I'm hearing, first of all, the energy to feel like to see all these leaders in the arts and people who work coming to council to commit, their time to this work. To me, demonstrates the critical role that core funding plays in investing in sort of the sustainability of the sector. But I'm going to say this for everything that Canada Council or arts funders do, there's no perfect system. So that balance between project and core has been ever thus. And there's always that dilemma of like, once you're in, how do you get out? Once you're out, how do you get in? What if you've never been in or out? How do you ever get in? And what does that mean? So we're very preoccupied by those questions. And for me, it's what are the accountabilities? If you are a recipient of core funding, what are the expectations of institutions and organizations? And they are very different from those who get project funding. And I'm very open to what other things we can also be doing along with project core. I talked about, this different approach we're trying with Alberta. We have co-delivery agreements with three co-delivery agreements with the far north, because we realize that from a perspective of ensuring that artists in the far north have access to funding, it wasn't really working for all sorts of cultural language reasons. So I'm very interested in the and question. So it's not like one or the other, it's all of it is necessary, and all of it has to keep transforming and evolving. And what core funding could have looked like 10 years ago, 20 years ago, what does it look like today, and what will it look like in 5 years, I think has to keep evolving. But it has to evolve hand in hand with, I think, funders or those who invest in the arts, public investment in the arts. But I'm also now interested in anyone, on any type of institution that's interested in investing, whether it's the business sector, the philanthropic sector, other government, that's not arts specific. We have to be engaged at every single level, at every single table, but hand in hand with the arts community. I can go on and
yeah.
I'm very passionate about it.
I want to go back to something you said in terms of I'm curious about the role of the funder in that conversation around how far do you think a funder can push in terms of ensuring sector sustainability? So if an larger institution has received funding year after year for decades, what is the role of the funder in that conversation of ensuring that they're supporting the larger sector? Because the reality is the pot isn't getting any bigger. So what can be done to support those who are emerging and coming up into the sector as of now?
No, it's probably the number one preoccupation that we have when it comes to looking at where our funding goes. And I think it goes back to, what do we expect from these organizations? And what we've seen is most organizations that receive core funding take that role of being community leaders extremely seriously. And we've seen example after example after example of arts institutions and arts organizations engaging with the communities that they serve. And that could be a large community like right here in Toronto, or it could be a very small community in St. John's, Newfoundland, where our board met last year. What we've seen is concrete evidence that when public funds are invested in these organizations, they bring back tremendous value to their community. So we've recently done some data analytics that show that for every $1 that the Canada Council has invested in core funding, those organizations have multiplied by almost $6 in their communities. So there's a huge economic impact. But that economic impact actually translates into things like jobs. So jobs for artists, jobs for arts administrators. It translates into the vitality of the communities that they're in. So restaurants, parking. We have a story of a festival in Blythe, Ontario, which is a tiny village, that the festival there helps the dry cleaner, family-owned dry cleaning business run. So there's so many dimensions where it's not just, it's the same organizations that keep on getting funding. It is those organizations that play critical roles in their communities, and that's what the peer assessment committees look at when they look at the criteria of who's getting the funding. It's not an automatic renewal. As I just mentioned, it's happening right now in our offices. it is an extremely profound look at what these organizations are doing. Now, of course, there are exit strategies. If an organization is no longer meeting the criteria or is not able to deliver, then they get exited. And of course, we always have space for new applicants to come in. But I think the question is bigger than just funding. Is what's the health and sustainability of the Canada's arts ecosystem? What is the rate at which organizations, are born and die? And that's normal. Like, you want organizations to be born and to die, and we've seen
cycles.
Exactly, we've seen examples of that. And there are ways of exiting that you can do it on your own terms. Sometimes it happens because of things that happen in the normal cycle of organizations. And this is where I think everyone who invests in the arts needs to talk about what happens when an institution starts exiting. And we do that. We have meetings with all the funders, no matter what organization, because no organization that I'm aware of really operates with a single grant. Like, it's not just from the Canada. They have a whole very sophisticated set of revenues and how their investments and funds are managed. But it is the number one question, I think, that all of us who work in investing in the arts ask ourselves, is how do we ensure the renewal and sustainability and transformation of the arts sector in this country?
It's interesting you brought up St. John's, because I think you know this, but I worked with Arts Council Newfoundland in redesigning their operating grants. And when we presented this idea to their grantees of, if you're receiving a certain amount of money, you have a responsibility to support those organizations that haven't yet found themselves in operating. And there was no resistance.
That's right.
And that's very interesting to me, that I do believe there's a role that funders can play in supporting and brokering those relationships, and just making it very abundantly clear that this has to be prioritized if we want to have and support the longevity of our arts and cultural sector.
I couldn't agree with you more. I think this is where, I talked about this idea of we need to work together. I sense that the arts sector feels that way too. I've never had anyone saying, well, no. I think, especially when it comes to organizations, the connection between organizations in certain regions, within disciplines, their role in communities, with other businesses, it's evident in every single city that I've visited, in every province and territory. But I think, back to how an organization like the Canada Council, I'm trying to shift how we even self-identify, if you will. Like, the language has been forever, Canada's arts funder, national arts funder. Like, yes, absolutely, we fund, but we invest and we convene and we partner and we collaborate. And that's where I think our role at the national level could really be, we can go in new directions in terms of convening and collaborating with the arts sector on solving what I call global issues around sustainability and transformation.
Amazing. You mentioned it, and so I want to bring it up as well. But I'm curious, when you think about the model in its entirety, what would you keep, and maybe where do you think there might be room for disruption? And what I wanted to just raise, because I think it's something I've heard that is a keep, is peer assessment. That certainly seems to resonate, I think, across the board as something that's essential within the model. That like you said, there's no perfect system, but that peer assessment is certainly going in that direction.
Yeah. Again, we go back to this idea that there's no perfect system, but peer assessment, to me, and I think to the Canada Council, is absolutely at the heart of how we make decisions. Because, and I'll reiterate this for people who may not know, but it's not the staff of the Canada Council. Like, I do not make any decisions on who's getting what grant. I rely on the system of peer assessment to advise on these questions, because one of the first things I said in this discussion we've been having is the accountability and transparency and the rigor that has been entrusted in the Canada Council around where the funding goes. If we don't have a robust system, an ethical, a system full of integrity, then those results will continuously be contested on the basis of like, how did you make this decision? And we don't really get pushback on that because of the peer assessment. What you get is a lot of questions like, how can I improve my grant application, or what was the process that was followed? And I really think that we have to keep deepening. And who are the peers is probably a better question to ask. Like, how do we keep expanding and being inclusive on the wide diversity of peer expertise in this country? But I think the system of investing in the arts has to just keep evolving. So I'm not at a stage where it's like, oh, let's get rid of that, and that's not. Everything has to keep moving with the forward vision of what are we trying to do. And what we're trying to do is look at the Canada Council's mandate. So it's an actual deeply inspiring and beautiful mandate. Our mandate is not give grants to artists and the arts sector. Our mandate is to foster and promote the study, enjoyment, and production of the arts. That's what it is. How do we do that? I ask myself that question every single day. How do we, the Canada Council, exercise this mandate with the utmost care, integrity, trust, relationship, accountability? And I don't want to position the Canada Council as at it on its own. We're doing this for Canadians. I think Canadians deeply care about having arts and culture in their communities, and we are part of a system and to support that ambition. And I think we have a historic moment in time now with what's happening in the world, with questions tied to sovereignty, nation building, identity. But I would even say more than that is the human connection, and the arts, I think, is what is at the heart of all of it.
Yeah, absolutely. What about some disruptors? Anything that you can think of that you might want to disrupt this system, especially when it comes to equity?
Yeah. So I don't like that kind of language is not my language. Like I don't use that language I think the nature of what we do should always be to question what we're doing. So that might mean the same thing. What I'm interested in is the constant evolution of where what we do has impact. So if we think that something we're doing doesn't have the greatest impact possible, like let's talk about it. Let's look at equity as a really important value system. And even if you think about how do you define equity, you ask 10 people, you'll get 10 different answers. There's no perfect answer for that. What we're trying to look at is all of the dimensions of equity. And, we recently talked about regional equity as a dimension that hasn't really been talked about, which is where does the funding go from this coast to coast to coast, but also who are the recipients of that funding. So when you look at questions of equity, you often look at questions of barriers. What is preventing access to funding? What's preventing fairness? What's preventing your capacity to reach audiences? Because it's not just who applies to funding and who gets grants, but who are the beneficiaries of that funding. So I'm very interested in discussing the audiences and the benefit to Canadians, and how does our work by funding and investing in artists and arts organization is actually reaching Canadians and giving opportunities to access the absolutely amazing talent that we have in this country.
That audience piece is curiosity of mine as well. How do we understand the experiences of our audiences, or even understand those who aren't coming, and why? Is something that remains a curiosity for me within mass culture, for sure. Because I think there's a lot of collaborative work that can be done around that as well. And it has to come from the ground up. Those who are most engaged with those communities.
I agree.
Or aspiring to connect with. So I'm also, because you are very well positioned on the international stage. You have been for a big part of your career, being involved in UNESCO. And I'm wondering if there are other emerging practices or things that you're looking to is like, oh, wow, I wish we could adopt something like that.
There's so much amazing work happening internationally, and I'm so thrilled because I was just named on the board of the International Federation of Arts Councils and Cultural Agencies, which essentially is an international network of all of us who are working in investing in the arts, and each country has a different model. Some has an arts council like the Canada Council, some countries it sits in their Ministry of Culture. But all to say that the more you think you're different, the more you realize you're the same, because the conversations that we have, say, in the Canadian context, so Canada Council also has a secretariat for the Canadian Public Arts Funders, so all the provincial and territorial arts councils. We meet with the tri-levels, meaning in each province and territory, all the levels of funders, and now at the international level. And the conversations are so similar. We're talking about the precarity of artists. We're talking about the precarity of public funding in the arts. We're talking about cross-sectoral partnerships. We're talking about equity. We're talking about safety. So many dimensions are incredibly aligned. But there's also some really interesting and inspiring stories. So to your question, if you look at Korea and what they've done with the K-wave, they made a decision in Korea about 20 years ago that culture was going to be their main business and economic driver. And it's transformed their economy, their culture, their identity. Now, nothing's perfect for sure, but I don't think you can go anywhere in the world and not know about K-pop, K-drama, but it was an intentional government strategy. You look at Ireland and all the work they're doing around basic income for artists. I mean, it's inspiring. So there are countries who are, in some of the European countries like France, for instance, you don't have to explain or advocate about why having artists are important. It's a given. You don't even have to have that conversation. So I'm very engaged in those international conversations, both around positioning. Canada is, what do we have to offer to the world, and we have a lot to offer, and also what can we learn from the world, and we have a lot to learn too.
Excellent. Is there anything else that you didn't get a chance to share that you'd like to?
No, you asked such excellent questions. You made me really think when I was on my way here. I think the last thing I would say is I would love to pursue these types of conversations with anyone who wants to have these types of conversations. I think we're at a point now where we have a huge opportunity in arts and culture around questions of nation building and sovereignty. And I say this in all of the broad aspirations around truth and reconciliation with Indigenous peoples, around cultural diversity, around accessibility, around artists. So in all of the dimensions of what we want to aspire Canada to stand for when it comes to arts and culture, I feel the Canada Council can do so much more. And we should not be limited by the fact that traditionally we've been positioned ourselves as arts funders. I think we should be the Canada Council for the Arts, broadly speaking, including, of course, investing in the arts through grants. But I'm open to new partnership strategies, new collaborations, convening, pursuing really deep reflections on policy questions and working with other sectors to deepen the reach and impact that the arts have, bottom line, on the people who live here. That's what we really exist for. At the bottom line is for people who live here or who look to Canada, is they see what an amazing arts and culture we have here, and anything Canada Council can do to support that, that's what I want to do.
One last question that we plan on asking everyone that we have on this series is, if you could change at least one thing in Canada's cultural policies to create a healthier, more resilient art ecosystem, what would it be?
I love that question. I thought about that question. It would be that we don't have to make the case for why investing in the arts is needed. If we can just stop, like for 30 years, I've worked at the Canada Council, and for 30 years, it's the same question, like, tell us why investing in the arts is so important and what the impact of that is. If we can stop asking that question because it becomes a given, it's a given that investing in the arts is critical, then we can move on to other things, which is like, how do we do better? How do we engage Canadians? How do we make the arts accessible no matter where you live? How do we ensure that artists are able to get out of precarity and make a living being an artist? How can organizations, have a long capacity to invest in their communities and not constantly be worrying about making the case for why investing in the arts is important? So I would say that would be like a dream, is that it becomes a given that investing in the arts is essential and we can do other stuff.
I'm on that ride with you. I'm all in. I couldn't agree with you more, and I think that's what we're certainly striving for as well. So thank you, Michelle.
Thank you, Robin. It's been an excellent conversation. I love this.
Yeah, me too. So now that we've just had this conversation with the oh-so-amazing Michelle Chawla from the Canada Council for the Arts for our first pilot episode, I wanted to bring you in, Michelle, who is our managing director at Mass Culture, to kind of take a quick moment to think about what were some takeaways for you.
I think what was most inspiring from what Michelle was speaking about was around change and around rethinking what funding is and thinking about investment. I think when I joined the sector many, many years ago, it was really about that and how can we make businesses out of this. And I think that investment really struck me in a way that I was like, yeah, that's how I think. And I think the biggest takeaway there is for us to really think differently as we look ahead, and to even think deeply about the work that we do and how we contribute to the community and also regionally at large. And those are the things that I'm really inspired by her conversation.
I was so taken by what she was said time after time and again about accountability. And that was resonating, not for her, it seemed like, just within the Canada Council for the Arts itself, but within the sector. And how we just all need to find ways of coming together, working in a more relational way, but really thinking about how we are accountable to ourselves as a sector, but also to the public.
Mm-hmm. High five.
Thank you for listening to this very special pilot episode of the Mass Culture Podcast, presented in partnership with the Arts Firm. If you, dear listener, find value in these kinds of conversations, our hope is to build an entire series dedicated to reimagining public arts funding in Canada. We'd love to hear from you. What one change would you suggest is needed to build a more balanced, sustainable, and equitable public funding model for the arts in Canada? I'll share some of the responses on our next episode. You can reach me at robin@massculture.ca. That's ROBIN at massculture.ca. I'm Robin Sokoloski, and this has been the Mass Culture Podcast, the pilot episode. Stay tuned for more episodes coming soon. Thanks for listening.